Good morning, good evening, good afternoon to everyone. My name is Matt Hosey. I'm the Director of Science and Technology for GFI, and I'm happy that you're all here today. This is the April 2023 seminar for the environmental impact of cultivated meat production. Before we get started, I have a few announcements. I'm excited to share that GFI's 2022 State of the Industry reports were launched earlier this week. This trio of reports covers all things alternative, including commercial landscape updates, partnerships, facilities, product trends, sales data, investment data, technical advancements, policy developments, and all new forecast sections that dig into industry forecasts and our outlook. Download your copies at the link in the chat. GFI will be hosting webinars covering the main takeaways from these reports later this month between April 20th and 27th. You can sign up for these webinars covering the latest global updates on the plant-based, fermentation-derived, and cultivated protein industries at the link in the chat. That would be gfi.org/events. Today, we are really lucky to have scientists from CE Delft, GFI, and GAIA who recently published a cultivated meat life cycle assessment in the International Journal of Life Cycle Assessment. This publication builds upon the findings from the cultivated meat life cycle assessment that GFI and GAIA commissioned and disseminated in 2021. In today's webinar, GFI lead scientist Dr. Elliot Swartz and CE Delft LCA specialist Pelle Sinke will review the updated data on the environmental impacts of cultivated meat versus conventional meat. Powered by data from over 15 companies across the cultivated meat supply chain, they will address emissions, land use, water use, air pollution, feed conversion, and more. And so without further delay, I'll hand it off to Dr. Elliot Swartz.
All right, great. Thank you, Matt. I will share my screen here, and then we can get started. So thank you for being here and welcome everyone. As Matt mentioned, my name's Elliot Swartz. I'm one of the scientists working on cultivated meat at the Good Food Institute. And today I'm going to be discussing the environmental impact of cultivated meat production, really summarizing and reviewing the key results from this recent publication. So we'll start with an overview of the background and the scope of the study, as well as some of the key assumptions that went into the model, which are all important for understanding and interpreting the results of the LCA. I'll touch on the conclusions, as well as some idea for future directions for other studies. And then we'll have plenty of time for a Q&A session, where we'll be joined by the lead author on the study, Pelle from CE Delft. So before we begin, I just wanted to touch on, for those that are unfamiliar with GFI or the Good Food Institute, we're an international network of nonprofits that are working to develop a roadmap for a more sustainable, secure, and just protein supply. And so we have teams spread across key regions around the world, including the US, Brazil, India, Israel, Europe, and the Asia Pacific region. And we all do the same sort of programmatic work in science and technology, corporate engagement, and policy to really create an innovation ecosystem that will drive alternative proteins forward. We are 100% supported by philanthropy, which means that for our science and technology work, we're able to fund a variety of open access research in alternative proteins, as well as some of the analysis work like the one that you'll hear about today. So let's talk about the background and scope of this study. So this story really started about 3.5 years ago when GFI, as well as another European organization called GAIA, commissioned this life cycle assessment, or LCA. And we also independently commissioned a techno-economic assessment, or TEA, where the goals of these studies were really to try to understand what the environmental impact and cost of commercial scale cultivated meat production would be like in the future. And for the future, we set it in the year 2030, which is about 10 years in the future from when the research began. And so to help us understand what production for cultivated meat would look like in the future, We recruited over 15 different companies across the supply chain, as well as 5 of the leading cultivated meat manufacturers to serve as data and knowledge providers, because we wanted to really track the actions and the goals of the industry closely and get primary data from the industry itself, which was something that was missing from previous studies that had been published in the past. So these 2 reports, which were led by CE Delft, were published around 2 years ago, initially as white papers. And we decided to do additional work on the LCA, or environmental impact analysis, by updating some of the data inventories. So revisiting some of the data inventories with companies as they were scaling up and becoming more mature, as well as conducting additional analyses that provide a little bit more nuanced analysis in understanding environmental impact. And so, as was mentioned, this study was published earlier this year in January in the International Journal of LCA. So when we talk about a life cycle assessment, this is really a methodology that aims to quantify the environmental impacts of a production process throughout its life cycle, or throughout certain stages of a life cycle. So in this case, the sort of the system boundary here is called cradle to gate. So this means we quantified all of the inputs along the upstream in the supply chain, such as the cell culture media, as well as the production itself at the facility, up until the point that that product is ready to leave the facility or the factory gate. And the functional unit, so what we're studying and what we're comparing to, is 1 kilogram of cultivated meat production compared to also conventionally produced chicken, pork, and beef. And for the cultivated meat production, we obtain data from companies that are working with a variety of different species and cell types, including seafood species, avian species, and mammalian species. And so the actual cultivated meat product that's modeled in this analysis is intended to be species agnostic. It's not meant to represent any particular product. And it's supposed to be representative of a sort of typical mincemeat product, like a nugget or a burger. You can see that the sort of macronutritional composition of the respective products are shown in this table here. Of note, there's a range given for cultivated meat based off the sort of range of data that was received from some of the companies. And also noteworthy is that most of the weight or mass of meat products are actually composed of water. So at a high level, I'll talk about the study design, and we'll go into this in a little bit more detail in the following slides. But essentially what we're trying to do here is quantify the environmental impacts of cultivated meat when it's produced in a facility that can output 10,000 metric tons of product per year. And as was mentioned, we wanted to simulate what production would look like in the future in 2030. And so we built a questionnaire and asked companies essentially, what are you doing today versus what are you going to be doing in the future? How do you envision your product and process to sort of progress? And so at a high level, that means increased production scale and efficiency. You have a media composition that is more defined with a little fewer components perhaps. And also we wanted to model and track the growth of renewable energy. And so this includes scenarios for production with entirely renewables versus average global energy mixes. And we aim to sort of simulate this or compare this to conventional meat in an apples to apples way as possible. And so the data for conventional meat, chicken, pork, beef, and beef, including beef from dairy production, is derived from intensive systems in Western Europe, including Ireland and the Netherlands. And we likewise didn't want to give any unfair advantage to cultivated meat. And so we built in improvements that could happen for conventional meat by 2030, including reduced methane and ammonia from cattle, renewable energy also being employed at farm and feed facilities, and no land use change emissions associated with soybean that's used in feed for chicken and pork. So let's go a little bit deeper into the assumptions that sort of underlie the model here for cultivated meat, especially for those that are more technically minded. You could see these are really the core set of assumptions that make up cultivated meat production, where in this facility, they are grown in a maximum size of a 10,000 liter reactor. using a semi-continuous process with 3 total harvests per run. There's a 10-day differentiation stage built in, and the cells are grown at fairly high density. And so overall, for the assumptions for cultivated meat and other assumptions throughout the study, we tried to be fairly conservative, so not very overly optimistic. And I think we did a pretty good job at ensuring that. With the exception of perhaps the density that's listed here, that I would say could be challenging perhaps for some of the companies in the industry to reach by the end of the decade. A lot of these other things we think are truly very attainable for companies in the field. So one of the other key inputs for the cultivated meat process is the cell culture media. You can see that the cell culture media composition is outlaid here in this table, which includes 3 different scenarios for cell culture media use that relates to the efficiency of the media use. So related to how efficiently those ingredients are converted into biomass, which is in turn tied to the metabolism of the cells. So unless otherwise stated, though, a lot of the data that I'll show you in the forthcoming slides really include this baseline scenario outlined in red for media. So there are 2 things about media. One is the composition itself, which you can see that is primarily composed of amino acids, sugars, salts, and a few other things like vitamins and recombinant proteins like growth factors. And we concluded that based on the data that we received, that around 600 to 800 grams of solids would be needed in the media to produce 1 kilogram of cultivated meat. And that's important to realize that, again, about 70% of meat is water weight. So in addition to the actual composition itself of the media, what also matters is the source of these media components like amino acids and sugars. Now, in this particular study, we assumed that 3/4 of the amino acids would be derived from a soy hydrolysate, and the remaining 25% would be supplied as individually fermented or synthesized amino acids, and the glucose would be derived primarily from corn. And so this has downstream consequences for some of the environmental indicators that we'll talk about, most specifically things like land use, where if you were to derive your amino acids from something like algae or cyanobacteria that are grown in ponds or in the ocean, then their land use could look substantially different, which we've seen in other LCA studies that have been performed. So that's just something to sort of keep in the back of your head for some of the reasons why some of the indicators are the way that they are. Lastly, for the media, you'll also note that most of the media by weight is actually composed of water, which is used to solubilize all of the components. And you'll note that 75% of the water is recycled in the production facility itself. And this is based off of estimates for other production processes, but is by no means an upper bound of what could be possible with water recycling. So looking at the assumptions for the production of conventional meat in 2030, these are outlined in detail here in this slide. You can see that methane emissions were modeled to be reduced by 15% through the addition of enzymes in feed for cattle, as well as lower ammonia emissions by about 5% through additional outdoor grazing. As mentioned, all of the conventional meat systems for 2030 scenarios also contain sustainable energy at their farm and feed facilities and no land use change associated with greenhouse gas emissions related to soy in the feed. So when we're thinking about the comparison between cultivated meat and conventional meat, it's important to understand, as I'll show in subsequent data, that these intensive systems in Western Europe that we are modeling based off of are already more efficient than the global average of production. And by increasing these so-called, by modeling these additional improvements, we reach a so-called ambitious benchmark for production in 2030, which you can see is actually quite substantially improved when it comes to the carbon footprint. So between 15 to up to 53% lower carbon footprints for chicken are modeled for 23. And as I'll show you in the following slides, that this really is sort of representative of some of the most efficient or lower carbon footprint meat production on Earth. So the last thing to sort of understand before we get into the data is that we also included energy scenarios for cultivated meat production based off of the source of energy throughout the supply chain. And that's broken down into scope 1, 2, and 3 emissions. So for those that are unfamiliar, scope 1 emissions refer to emissions that are sort of burnt directly on site. Scope 2 are emissions that are purchased. So really anything that can be used to keep the lights on, like things like electricity. And then scope 3 is really anything else. So throughout the supply chain upstream and downstream emissions are accounted for in scope 3. Now, the important context here is that food, beverage, and meat companies often have the vast majority of their emissions attributable to scope 3. And as you can imagine, because this includes the whole supply chain, these are typically more difficult to reduce because they lie outside of a company's direct control. So there's a lot of actors involved in the supply chain that need to buy in and that need to, sort of be practicing more sustainable production processes in order to sort of cumulatively reduce the emissions of the process. And so we wanted to understand if this also applied to cultivated meat. So you'll see in the data that I'll show you, we also have built in these energy scenarios for cultivated meat, where we first assumed that cultivated meat would be produced using an average energy mix based off of 2019 global average data, which is still sort of predominantly fossil fuels. Then we have a scenario where renewable energy would be used for scope 1 and 2 emissions with an average mix for the rest of the supply chain. And then we have this sort of ambitious benchmark scenario for 2030, where renewable energy would actually be, sort of the main source for the entire production process. All right, so let's talk about some of the results, starting with the carbon footprint. So this is one of the takeaway figures from the report. And you can see that produced with a global average energy mix, cultivated meat would have a carbon footprint of around 14 kilograms of CO2 equivalents per kilogram of meat. And you can see that the vast majority of this carbon footprint is attributable to energy use at the facility through the cell cultivation processes. And we also have a fairly substantial fraction of the overall carbon footprint attributable to the cell culture medium. Now, you'll also note that if cultivated meat manufacturers switched to renewable energy, so they were using and sourcing renewable energy at their facilities, they could reduce their carbon footprint by about 70%. So most of these overall emissions are attributable to scope 1 and 2, which differs from conventional meat production systems. And furthermore, if cultivated meat manufacturers were to work with suppliers in their supply chain that are also using sustainable practices like renewable energy at their production facilities, then you could reduce the carbon footprint even further, as shown here. So the question is, how does this compare to conventional meat? So here are the carbon footprints of conventional meat, which you can see here. Shown here on the right is the global average of each production system, which is based off of this study published a few years ago that looked at thousands of different production systems all around the globe. Shown in the middle bar in the light green color is the sort of current Western European intensive production processes that are modeled off of Ireland and the Netherlands, respectively, which, as you can see, are lower than the global average of production. And then in the blue bar, you have the 2030 scenario, which adds on additional improvements that we could anticipate by 2030, which reduces the carbon footprint even further, and which is especially low for chicken production. So looking at cultivated meat, you can see these are the same data that I showed previously, but now aligned with the same y-axis for more easy comparison. You can see that cultivated meat produced using a global average energy mix would have a lower carbon footprint than the global average of beef production, but perhaps a higher carbon footprint than the global average of chicken and pork production. If cultivated meat manufacturers use renewable energy in their production process, then their carbon footprint could be lower than the intensive systems in Western Europe today. And when we compare the 2030 scenarios in these blue bars, which I'll just show you on this slide for a more easy comparison, you could see that cultivated meat could have substantially reduced carbon footprint and global warming impacts compared to beef, also compared to pork, and about the same or be competitive with really optimistic forms of conventional chicken production. So as I mentioned before, when you look at these numbers for conventional meat, their carbon footprints are quite low. And so it's unlikely that, you know, a majority or even a small minority of production systems in the future would have carbon footprints this low. And just to sort of illustrate this, we can look at the production sort of carbon footprints of current conventional meat production systems, again, based off of this study that looked at thousands of global conventional meat production systems. So shown here is the 5th percentile data. So essentially the top 5% or most efficient or lowest impact production for each representative category. And in this graph, I've just showed this for the cultivated meat produced using renewable energy at the facility itself. So not throughout the entire supply chain. You can see that cultivated meat produced using renewable energy would be able to have a lower carbon footprint, perhaps in the vast majority of conventional beef, pork, and even farmed crustacean and seafood production today. Maybe not quite as big of a percentage against chicken, but still a substantial reduction likely compared to most forms of global chicken production. All right, so another way of looking at these data is to assess the actual source of emissions. And so obviously there are a variety of different greenhouse gases, carbon dioxide, methane, nitrous oxide. And for agricultural products, land use change is also an important component that also typically makes up a fraction of the overall carbon footprint. So you can see that these data are the same that I was showing you before, but now broken down by the emission type. And I think it becomes quite obvious that the majority of emissions for cultivated meat production are attributable to carbon dioxide. So a lot of people might look at this and think, you know, this is very bad or a negative thing because we obviously want to limit the amount of carbon dioxide we're putting in the atmosphere, the leading cause of global warming. It sticks around in the environment and in the atmosphere for hundreds, if not thousands of years, etc. But I think another way to look at this is taking the sort of positives on this data, which is understanding that, you know, by electrifying meat production, as we're doing with cultivated meat, this enables a very high degree of control over the carbon footprint, because as we showed before, these emissions are primarily scope 1 and 2 emissions. So cultivated meat manufacturers should really be looking at this data and understanding that they have a lot of power and control over their carbon footprint, which is not the same for conventional meat producers, where a majority of their emissions are typically scope 3. So this means they should really be incentivized to build their facilities in places where renewable energy is abundant, or where it's becoming abundant more quickly than other parts of the world, or simply they could install renewable energy capacity at their production facilities themselves through the installation of things like solar panels on the roofs. Another key aspect of sort of interpreting this data is to understand that the cultivated meat industry today is extremely nascent. It's very small. You know, on a sort of total production scale, it's probably only producing in the low tons of product per year currently. And so that means its carbon footprint is also quite small and will remain small overall for the coming years as it scales up. And so similarly to electric cars, cultivated meat is going to scale up and develop as we globally undergo a global energy transition to hopefully more decarbonized sources of energy, where those become much, much more abundant than they are compared to today. And so with that, emissions will likely reduce over time. And because they're primarily carbon dioxide emissions, we can expect this to be a substantial reduction, or at least track the global sort of decarbonization trend over time. So those are all positives, I think, for cultivated meat, but we have to look at also conventional meat production. And you can see the emissions profile here, where you can, I think, see quite clearly that the emissions profiles are more distributed for conventional meat. People are probably familiar that methane makes up a substantial fraction of beef's overall carbon footprint, but also things like nitrous oxide and land use change are considerable fractions throughout the conventional meat supply chain. So not only does this make them more difficult to reduce through single actions because they're different sources of emissions, but they're also harder to coordinate because they're primarily scope 3 emissions and require a lot of coordination throughout the entire supply chain to reduce. So while people are working on technologies to reduce conventional meat's carbon footprints, some of which are accounted for in our 2030 projection scenarios, the degree to which you can reduce each of these is limited because some of these are just inherent to animal meat production. So I think all of that is important to take into account when you assess cultivated meat's carbon footprint and its potential to be reduced and the rate at which it can be reduced in the future. All right, so we talked about carbon footprints, and that's often the attention in the popular press. That's where most people sort of lock their eyes onto. But I think that's a little bit short-sighted. Some people call it carbon tunnel vision, because obviously environmental impact and sustainability overall means much more than just looking at the carbon footprint. So we're going to spend the next couple of minutes talking about the other environmental indicators that were assessed in this study, starting with the feed conversion ratio, which is really important to understanding sort of what underpins all of these differences in production. All right, so the feed conversion ratio essentially tries to tally or quantify, how much feed do we have to put in to get a given quantity out of the process. And I think people are pretty familiar with the fact that we grow crops to feed them to animals, which is accounted for here in this row. We also grow crops for other purposes, and those byproducts from that production, those production processes are also fed to animals quite a bit. And then in some cases, for certain animals like ruminants, they can eat human inedible products like grasses, which you can see accounted for here. And so the feed conversion ratio is a function of, in cultivated meat's case, the cell line's metabolism at converting this feedstock into biomass. And likewise for the conventional meat, the animal's metabolism overall at converting these different feed into biomass. And so when we quantify the total biotic material that it takes to create a given quantity or 1 kilogram of meat, you can see overall that cultivated meat is a more efficient process at turning biotic materials into meat. So it could be nearly 3 times as efficient as chicken production, around 4.5 times as efficient as pork, and nearly 6 times as efficient as beef. And beef in particular here is sort of given the benefit of the doubt. It actually looks better than it might otherwise would, because grass is excluded from the calculation, and beef that are grown in Ireland actually consume quite a bit of grass here. And so this point is really the whole purpose of cultivated meats, where we're growing just the cells that we need for meat production. So just the muscle, just the fat. We don't have to raise an entire animal, which has tissues that we don't consume, and other processes, where it's burning energy throughout its lifetime in a more inefficient manner than otherwise would be growing just the cells. And so overall, when fewer crops need to be grown, this translates into less land needed to be used, less fertilizer, fewer pesticides, et cetera, for meat production, which has downstream consequences on other environmental indicators. So let's talk about land use, which is probably the largest long-term lever that we have for mitigating things like climate change and biodiversity loss. You can see that cultivated meat can substantially reduce land use impacts compared to any form of conventional meat production, between, let's say, 60 to up to 90% when we compare to beef. Now, today, we use about 77% of the arable land on Earth for animal agriculture, either growing crops to feed to animals or grazing animals on that land. And so it's important to understand that if cultivated meat is able to substitute in future diets, then in theory, at least some portion of that land could be freed up or could be used for other purposes where it's not being used anymore to grow food for animals or to graze animals. And so we refer to this as the carbon opportunity of the land use. And in particular, this carbon opportunity metric is not calculated. In this study, this requires sort of additional analysis, but it is possible that if you accounted for that in the future with, sort of growing shares of the market based on cultivated meat, you could substantially offset your carbon footprint of cultivated meat even more if you were able to repurpose that land for things like carbon sequestration, in reforesting or rewilding certain aspects of the land, or using that land for even renewable energy production. And so I think it will be interesting, and we definitely encourage other people to perform these studies, especially in different geographies, to understand how land could be used more efficiently for the environment and for biodiversity loss. Those studies will be really important to influencing the establishment of policies that can actually ensure that that land is used in the best way possible for humans, for animals, and for the planet overall. So definitely an important thing to track over time as alternative proteins gain a larger market share in the future. So another category of indicator that we looked at is blue water use. So blue water use specifically refers to water that is derived from freshwater sources like rivers, lakes, or streams, as well as aquifers. So it doesn't account for overall rainwater. You can see that cultivated meat may actually increase blue water use compared to chicken, pork, and beef from dairy production, but have decreased water use compared to beef that are strictly raised as cattle for beef production. Now, it's important to understand when interpreting this data that, as mentioned, this blue water use is dependent on regional scarcity. So it's dependent on how much fresh water is available in the region that you're comparing to. It's also sensitive to how water recycling is implemented in the facility. And for cultivated meat in particular, the upstream production of media components contributes quite heavily to this footprint. And so that means there's an opportunity for suppliers of cell culture media inputs to establish water recycling practices at their facilities, or more sustainable practices for water use overall, which can contribute to reducing the overall blue water use footprint in the future. Another indicator is the fine particulate matter formation, which we can otherwise sort of refer to as air pollution. So you can see from these data that cultivated meat has the potential to reduce air pollution by up to 94% compared to beef production, and also substantially reduce it compared to pork and chicken as well. And we think that these results in particular are probably quite robust because they're strongly linked to ammonia and nitrogen related emissions from conventional processes. So with cultivated meat, we need less feed, which means less fertilizer needed. And also, because we're not growing animals, we're just growing cells, you have the absence of manure production, which are strongly linked to the sort of fine particulate matter that we're referring to here. And so, in the future, it might not be so bad to live next to a cultivated meat facility, as some folks that live quite close to large-scale animal operations suffer negative human health impacts, asthma, respiratory, or other cardiovascular, diseases due to their close proximity to these animal operations that are polluting the air. Acidification, which really refers to the acidification of soils, is also strongly tied to ammonia and nitrogen related emissions. And therefore, cultivated meat also has substantial reductions in acidification compared to its conventional counterparts. So you can see that compared to beef, it's up to 98% reduced, pork by 78%, and chicken by nearly 70%. So these are quite substantial reductions in acidification. And acidification is really a metric of overall soil health. And downstream of that soil health, you have effects on local biodiversity, the number and the diversity of plants that can live in those soils, et cetera, can be affected. And so this is also really important contributor to the concern around biodiversity loss. And lastly, another category that's strongly tied to these ammonia and nitrogen related emissions is marine eutrophication, which basically aims to quantify nitrogen equivalents. And people might be familiar with marine eutrophication because it's really a process that is caused primarily due to agricultural runoff that enters rivers and streams, and then goes down and enters oceans. Typically you find these dead zones due to eutrophication processes at the mouths of large rivers around the globe. And so because this is again tied to these ammonia and nitrogen related emissions, cultivated meat can potentially substantially reduce marine eutrophication impacts quite a bit compared to any form of conventional meat production today. Now, if we look on freshwater eutrophication, on the other hand, this attempts to quantify the sort of phosphorus equivalents rather than nitrogen. Cultivated meat here looks a little bit different. It may actually increase freshwater eutrophication compared to chicken, pork, and beef from dairy production, but still remain less than overall beef production, which is typically the highest in most environmental indicator categories. Now, another sort of caveat to this data is that freshwater eutrophication is very dependent on the wastewater treatment processes that manufacturers are going to employ at the facility, and also that upstream supply chain contributors will employ in their facilities as well. And so we actually don't have the best data yet on the types of wastewater treatment processes that are being used in cultivated meat facilities or throughout the supply chain. And so this is an area that could potentially be adjusted in the future with better data. And so these results are right now a little bit uncertain compared to some of the other ones that I showed previously. All right, so another important category to look at is the overall energy demand, or the cumulative energy demand of production. You can see that cultivated meat, the bar here is quite high, quite higher compared to any form of conventional meat production. So it's expected that cultivated meat will be probably an energy intensive process. However, when you interpret this slide, it's important to note that our assumptions around energy demand were quite conservative. And so essentially what we assumed in this study is that cells that were grown at high densities in these bioreactors would actually be releasing metabolic heat. And they would release so much heat that they would actually need to be cooled down. The bioreactor would actually need to be actively cooled down throughout the production process, and that substantially more energy would be spent on cooling the bioreactors than actually heating them up to the body temperature of the animal or the animal cells at which they normally grow. And so about 75% of the overall energy demand here is actually attributable to that cooling assumption. So in addition to cooling being present, we actually selected probably the worst form or least sustainable form of cooling that one could implement in their facility, where you're basically using active cooling systems to sort of actively refrigerate or cool down the water, and then pump that and circulate that throughout the bioreactor surface to cool it down. And so, if you talk to different people in the industry, some people think at this scale of production, you might not even need cooling to be implemented at all. And overall, I think this is just an area that needs, more quality data around. But you can just, sort of take this data when you look at this bar and sort of treat it as maybe a sort of worst case scenario for cultivated meat, or at least near that worst case scenario for the cooling processes that we account for here. And so I'll show you in some future slides that we can perform scenario analysis to understand cooling effects on energy demand and carbon footprint. So this is just the energy demand now broken down by the process stage at the facility itself. I've highlighted here that you can see that the majority of energy is being attributed to this large scale proliferation stage, as this is where cooling would be expected to be employed if it is employed. One of the interesting metrics that you can look at is sort of what this translates to from a kilowatt hour per kilogram of meat perspective, which comes out to around 22. So obviously, if cultivated meat were to scale up and we were producing millions of tons of cultivated meat, this would be quite an increase in energy demand on the grid. But it's important to keep in mind, obviously, that the scenario that I just mentioned could be a worst case scenario. If you look at other studies, for instance, and try to estimate this metric, it's substantially less, closer to between 3 and 9 kilowatt hours per kilogram of meat. And so I think, overall, this will be an important metric to track in future studies, especially as we can incorporate primary data from cultivated meat manufacturers as they scale up in their facilities to really estimate, what would be the energy demand in the future with a cultivated meat, with a given market share of cultivated meat. All right, and the last piece of data that I'll talk about now is the different scenarios that we analyzed. And scenario analysis can be used to essentially identify the hotspots that are most attributable or most influential over the overall environmental impact. So these are really the knobs that manufacturers can think about turning on or off in their process, or optimizations to make in order to influence environmental impact. So we looked at shorter or longer production timelines, higher and lower cell densities, larger or smaller cell volumes, whether or how efficiently the media is used, as mentioned before, the number of harvests per batch, which simulates a sort of move toward more continuous processes being implemented, and also smarter cooling systems. So I'll just highlight on this slide, these data are broken down also by the carbon footprint, the energy scenarios that are used throughout the study. But just to highlight 2 of the best performing scenarios, smarter cooling and also moving or simulating continuous processes can further reduce the carbon footprint of cultivated meat production by around 13 to 33%, depending on your energy source assumptions. Now, importantly, if you took the best performing scenarios and you compounded those, you could get even further reductions, but we didn't do that in this particular analysis. So this table shown here on the right is shown graphically here. And again, the best case scenarios are just highlighted of interest. If cultivated meat were produced using renewable energy throughout its supply chain, then the carbon footprint could potentially be as low as around 2.2 or 2.3 kilograms of CO2 equivalents. On the opposite end, for the worst case scenario, inefficient media use is really, would increase your overall environmental impact. So this means that media could be, a cause of this could be that you have a cell line with poor metabolism or non-optimized metabolism, or it could also be that your media formulation itself is just including ingredients that are not being metabolized, or you have more ingredients in there that you actually need for what you're trying to accomplish. So these are all things that manufacturers can take a close look at to understand what aspects of their process are going to have the best environmental outcomes. So to conclude this study, I think this work, as well as some of the other publications, I think give us a pretty strong idea of the environmental impacts of cultivated meat production, what their primary drivers are, which are the amount and sourcing of energy used at the facility, the sourcing and also the production of inputs that go into the medium, and then also the efficiency of medium use. So the feed conversion ratio, the metabolism of the cell, those are all really important things that influence overall environmental impact. So to summarize just some of the key points that we discussed, cultivated meat could be nearly 3 times as efficient as chicken production. That it requires far less land and results in less air pollution, soil acidification, and marine eutrophication compared to conventional meat production. Importantly, the majority of the carbon footprint for cultivated meat is due to scope 1 and 2 emissions. So manufacturers can significantly reduce their carbon footprint by about 70% by using and resourcing renewable energy at their facilities. So again, a strong incentive for manufacturers to locate and site their facilities in places where renewable energy is abundant or will become abundant at faster rates, or simply install renewable energy capacity themselves. And then finally, if manufacturers do this in the short term, the carbon footprint of cultivated meat would likely be lower than the vast majority of current conventional meat production based on the data that we currently have. So that's all, I think, a positive outlook for cultivated meat. Now, to end with some future directions for future studies based on the work that we've been doing for the past couple of years. We could always use more experimental data to refine some of the formulations for the media. Again, based on a variety of different cell type and species, metabolism and biomass composition data from the cells themselves. We also need to do a better job at estimating this energy demand for cooling, especially in future facilities. Some ideas for future studies is looking into the carbon opportunity related to land use, as I described. Looking at hybrid cultivated meat products. So this is mixing a certain amount or percentage of animal cells with plant-based products at varying percentages, which we actually anticipate to probably dominate the market throughout this decade. We can also think about doing region-specific studies or LCAs, especially with regions with high renewable energy or cool water resources that can be implemented for passive cooling. And then also technology-specific LCAs. We often get questions, does this data apply to seafood? What about fat production versus muscle? How does differentiation influence the overall impact? So these are all areas that I think we need further study into. And also for scenario analyses specifically, we can look at increased biomass during differentiation. So we actually, in this study, during that 10-day differentiation phase, we don't assume any biomass is really added to the cells, when in reality, this is probably the point at which a substantial fraction of biomass would be added. So again, we were sort of conservative with this assumption, but it's really because we don't have great data yet. And so that's something that future researchers can look into. Also, other bioreactor formats like hollow fiber or airlift, incorporating continuous processing, recycling not just water in the facility, but also other media components like growth factors, the salts, lactate especially. There will be a lot of lactate being sort of excreted by these cells. That could potentially offset your carbon footprint in the future if you're able to use it as a co-product. And then finally, different sources of media ingredients. We assume they come from soy or corn, but really they can come from a variety of different streams, algae, crops, different waste streams. Those are all different things that people can look at in the future. So although I'm presenting the work today and I'm a co-author on the study, the credit for this work really goes to the research team at CE Delft. They built the study design, they performed the modeling, they worked with these companies, which are recognized here, that worked on the study with them to supply data and knowledge. So really the full credit goes to the team at CE Delft. And also want to recognize GAIA for helping to fund the study, and Hermes from GAIA for being a co-author throughout the work stream. So thank you for your time and attention and listening, and we should have plenty of time for questions, where I'll be joined by Pelle from CE Delft. So thank you.
It looks like most of the questions have been answered. One of the right now that I'm trying to interpret here were the bioreactor cooling requirements modeled using CHO from Biopharma, mammalian heat generation assumption? And perhaps we can, if it's not clear, we can ask the questioner to clarify.
So thanks for the question. Yeah, the bioreactor cooling requirements were modeled based on specific parameters. So, for example, the oxygen uptake rate and different parameters supplied with the study by the energy specialists. And I think there were some interesting questions already answered, which maybe we can repeat here. One open question here is still, how can the waste generated in the production of cultivated meats, such as spent media, be managed in an environmentally responsible manner? I think this is a very interesting question for companies to look at. What is actually the exact composition of their waste stream and what can be recovered. This is technological as well as a financial question as well for these companies. But preferably, you want to first reduce your waste and then reuse what you can without many steps in between, and then recycle what you can. You want to recycle this into your cultivated meat supply chain primarily, but if that is not possible, for example, you can try to isolate the lactate and use this as an input for example, lactic acid production. We did not look into that, but there were other studies that did estimate this, and this can result in a reduced carbon footprint for your final product because you actually create a useful product to which part of the emissions are allocated. I think an interesting question as well, which comes back often, so I'd like to repeat that here, is there a difference between species? So as the way this study was set up, we did not differentiate between the individual species. And to our knowledge and for the data that we received, other factors are more important. So for example, of course, how much energy you use and what is the source of this energy, how efficient is your media usage, what ingredients are in your media, but also what bioreactor platform are you using, and to what extent are you having a mature or a structured product. So these are all aspects that were covered in the study, and for some we selected one one option. For example, we looked at a minced meat product, and for other we defined scenarios, for example, for the energy use. One more question I think is good that we highlight in the discussion of the paper. It's regarding the maybe future competition for available renewable energy. The question asked is, in the future, isn't the competition for renewable energies also necessary to electrify transport, for example, likely to be a major constraint for the development of cultivated meat? And I think this is a very important issue to highlight towards policymakers as well, that indeed we are talking about electrifying the food system here in part, not just cultivated meat, but also other high-tech alternative proteins. They are more efficient in terms of feed and resources, but they do need additional energy. So we will have to generate all this energy sustainably by renewable energy. So this is also a policy question, and also I think necessary to start including this in scenarios. If you're talking about futures of the energy system and futures of the food system, then we do need to include the energy demand in there.
Looks like there's some new questions in the open Q&A chat now.
Right. The cleaning and sterilization of the bioreactors, we modeled a cleaning in place and a steam in place system for this.
I think there was also a question about single-use reactors. Was that considered in this analysis?
No, in this analysis, we did not consider single-use reactors. I've seen some research, I think the person was referring to, regarding the potential benefits of this. But in our questionnaire, we received most of the input that at the scales that we model here, the 10,000 liter scale, it will be most likely to be reusable stainless steel bioreactors with a cleaning system in place to be used. So I think this is a very interesting topic to look at further, the single use. Also, if you're going towards maybe smaller scale production and scale out, this might be an interesting avenue to perform some LCA.
Yeah, I'll just add there. I think we do know cultivated meat manufacturers. Some of them do use single-use systems in their CHC train right now, especially at small scale. As mentioned, a lot of these single-use systems currently max out at a certain scale, and so they haven't really been employed at beyond like 6,000 liters. I think is the maximum single-use system that's installed right now. That's not to say that's the upper bound, but that's definitely a limitation for incorporating them as a primary bioreactor system for cultivated meat production. And then I will mention that there have been LCAs for single use versus sort of stainless steel bioreactor systems by Cytiva. I'll try to drop the link in the chat, but sort of paradoxically, a lot of people think single use would be less sustainable, but actually that's not the outcome that was observed in these particular studies. So I'll drop a link to that in the chat.
There's a question here about from Andre. What analysis do you recommend doing from a food safety standpoint?
So I'm not sure about life cycle assessment related to food safety per se, but I mean, with respect to food safety itself, generally, you would treat cultivated meat really as any other food, where you identify the hazards, you try to, sort of assess the risk associated with each of those hazards. You aim to mitigate those risks throughout your production process. So the FAO and the WHO actually just collaborated on a report that sort of is the first step of this food safety hazard identification process. I was actually one of the experts that was recruited to be part of that. So I think, there are, with respect to food safety, it's all about how you actually manage food safety in your production system. So, a lot of these hazards in cultivated meat are things that we're very well familiar with. That doesn't mean that cultivated meat is sort of a priori safe. You still have to, implement standard food safety processes and mitigation steps in your production. But, overall, I think we're starting to see regulators approve these products as they get on the market, which suggests that manufacturers know how to mitigate any of the potential hazards that are presented throughout.
One of the other questions in here, I think that we haven't addressed is many processes at the large scale are modeled based on pharmaceutical processes. What differences do you expect between pharma and food grade processes, and how are these differences modeled in the LCA?
It's a good question. Indeed, a lot of the technology for cultivated meat comes from the pharma sector. And some of the ingredients currently produced are also pharma grade, I should say, used for input. In this LCA, we looked at the culture medium ingredients, most of them produced at a food grade scale. In some cases, we did need to look at comparable industries that are already at food grade, for example, fermentation industries, producing amino acids that are already at food grade or feed grade even levels. But in some cases, it was also not possible. So in that case, we used a more conservative pharma grade estimate. Based on my LCA experience, the difference between food and pharma grade is regarding an environmental footprint is less than if you look at the economic picture. So in terms of price, there's a huge difference between food and pharma grade. In terms of environmental footprint, this difference is also there, but it's smaller.
Yeah, I think just to add, I think that's an area for future research, of course, especially with respect to, amino acid production. There's only been, I think, a few LCAs that, have been performed to date on that, and also recombinant protein production. I think there's still more work to be done to understand environmental impact, especially for different production platforms beyond just, microbial fermentation, but also, what we're seeing with plant molecular farming and cell-free production and these other up and coming platforms. We just don't really know the impacts there yet, I think.
A good question here I see is regarding the blue water use. If it's blue water intensive, the cultivated meat production, how can it be produced in a sustainable manner in water scarce regions? I think it's important to understand regarding the blue water use is that a part of this is at the facility for cultivated meat, but also a large part of it is upstream in the production of culture medium ingredients. So if you're talking about production, then you're actually looking at different production locations. For all of these, I think it's best to optimize and make sure you can get the most sustainable water supply as possible. In some cases, of course, you also want to have your production close to the consumer, if you're talking about food security, for example. And then, well, you will have to place at least the final step in your production supply chain at a place that can be water scarce. Then, of course, recycling is a very important aspect.
The question in here that says, did the study take into account the different efficiencies of cells within the proliferation differentiation phases? What were some assumptions made?
Yeah, regarding assumptions around efficiency of cell and cell behavior in these phases, I think important are that we include multiple scenarios for the culture medium consumption. That also includes, of course, the efficiency of this. And in the differentiation phase, we assume that there will be no additional growth of the cells. So no mass increase, and in that sense, that can be seen as quite conservative because other studies do assume some mass increase during that phase. I think those are two important assumptions.
Yeah, I think just to add to that, I mean, just from a biological perspective, there definitely is metabolic shifts during differentiation, cellular differentiation. It's just that was sort of outside of the scope of what we could include here. I think partially because the data there is just not necessarily well understood. So I mean, I think it would be interesting for future LCAs to look closely at that metabolic shift during differentiation, characterize, how the media composition might change and how the biomass sort of ratio, feed conversion ratio might change as well during those two different stages.
Lucas asks or says, thanks for your great work. What are you most uncertain about with this model and LCA output?
Nice question. Yeah. Well, I think what I'm most uncertain about is the biggest uncertainties in this study, which is mainly, I think, at this point, the energy use. As Elliot already talked about just now. We made quite conservative assumptions around energy use. Also, if you compare it to other studies, and I'm talking about facility energy use. So we made quite conservative assumptions regarding cooling, for example, just also because there's no real world data at these scales yet available. And I think seen as how important energy use and is for the carbon footprint, this would be the point that I want to improve most.
Pete is asking about the capital cost, almost like the capital life cycle costs of setting up these facilities. He says, how does building of cultivated meat facility and equipment compare to conventional meat facilities in terms of life cycle analysis?
So a couple of years ago, together with the first LCA study, we also performed a techno-economic assessment of cultivated meat, in which the costs were included. In a life cycle assessment, costs are not included in that sense, so we do not look at facility costs. I think obviously the cost of building a cultivated meat facility is high if you compare it to, for example, a stable where animals are reared. On the other hand, the supply chains of animal production systems are very large and potentially even larger and more widespread in terms of geographical coverage. So yeah, it's also a complexity. Yeah, Elliot just shared the link to the techno-economic assessment.
Yeah, and I'll just add on that, because I didn't include this in the actual slide deck, but we excluded the actual buildings themselves from the life cycle assessment or the environmental impact. So we sort of assumed that, the steel and the concrete that would be used to construct a slaughterhouse or a feed processing facility versus a cultivated meat facility would look the same, but we do account for the bioreactor itself. So in this case, the bioreactor, we sort of assume that is sort of replacing the body of the animal, or it's serving as the function of the body of the animal. So that is included in the life cycle assessment here, but the buildings themselves are not, and you can also sort of amortize those over a longer span, or like 20 years of the lifespan of the building, so they become substantially less of an overall environmental impact compared to like the operational inputs of production. If that makes sense.
And there's a somewhat, I think, similar question here. Somebody asked about, anonymous asked about, does the LCA take into account the footprint from the quality control or food safety testing, as in lab testing? And I'm assuming what they mean is the difference between the, conventional meat versus, cultivated meat in terms of food safety testing.
Do I understand correctly that we're talking about at the facility sampling and doing additional food safety testing before the product goes out?
Yes, I think that's what they're referring to.
Yeah, all right. That is not included in this LCA, not for cultivated meat, but also not for conventional meat, where it can happen as well. In some LCAs, things like this are considered, but if you're looking at truly industrial production scales, then this is usually marginal.
Here's an interesting question. Maybe you haven't done this calculation, but thanks for the interesting presentation. In order to get to mass production, how many bioreactors would be needed to produce the same amount of meat as a medium-sized traditional meat facility?
Indeed, I haven't done this calculation.
Back of the envelope.
But I think on a higher level, you can say that a few things are important here, and that is what scales you are in terms of how many bioreactors you need, how many harvests you do, so to what extent you're having a continuous process or not. We see in terms of land area that you can have a lot more meat being produced on a smaller plot of land than for conventional meat production. Yeah. It would be interesting to do this calculation in terms of a global scale, how many bioreactors you would actually need.
Yeah, and I'll just add for reference, I'm sorry, I'm trying to bring up I got logged out of my slide deck, but let me just share my screen real quick again. So I skipped over the sort of like the production line that's modeled in the facility, which you can see here. So this is actually, I didn't want to get into the weeds here on this presentation, but this is actually the production process, or a production line in the facility. And you can actually think about this production process or line being sort of copy and pasted in this facility 130 times. So, this is the sort of seed train and the 10,000 liter reactor and your 3 harvests that you do to feed into the differentiation reactor and the output of meat that results from that. And you can see, so you need really 130 10,000 liter reactors to meet this given quantity of cultivated meat production, with the given assumptions that we include in this study. So there's a lot of variability that one can get when you, I think, alter the type of bioreactors, the overall bioprocess, as well as some of the assumptions that go into these models. But yeah, nevertheless, I think people will be looking to make those sorts of comparisons, as cultivated meat starts to scale up.
I think there's just a couple more questions here. Someone asked about comparing U.S. locations to European locations, but I think the general sense of the question is how sensitive is the life cycle analysis to, aside from like renewable energy availability, to regional location of these facilities?
Yeah. That's a good question. In terms of renewable energy, that's important, and the energy profile from the grid will be different in different places in the world. Besides that, there will also be differences in the average markets for feed products, for example, and for ingredients. Where do they come from? How are they produced? And then there are some aspects that are really regional environmental aspects and that are not covered very well in LCA. For example, if you're really looking at water pollution at a local level. And then that is something that you need to dive into like on a location specific, in the location specific way. And life cycle assessment really gives you the image of like the grand picture of how the environmental profile in your supply chain looks like.
And I think our final question here is Ratan says, and this is, I think this is more of a question of definition. So this is a little less about the life cycle analysis, but it says, is cultivated meat considered a bioengineered product or just a branch of advanced food processing technology?
Yeah, I mean, I guess it comes down to semantics. I mean, in the United States, there's actually a definition of bioengineered product. There's a label for that, which is really sort of related to, genetically modified ingredients in the product, which cultivated meat, of course, could be genetically modified if you want to, or it could not be. So that's really up to the manufacturer to decide. Overall, I mean, I think it's an evolution in food technology, and we now have the ability to grow the animal cells instead of the animal. And so that's what we're trying to accomplish here. And hopefully that comes with positive benefits such as environmental impact, as we discussed. And the last question is just on cell loss. And I don't think we haven't really modeled cell loss or viability at different stages. That's a little bit too nuanced for this model, but yeah, there's no cell loss during differentiation that's modeled to my knowledge, right?
No, indeed. Yeah.
Okay, well, thank you, Elliot, for that extremely clear presentation, and clearly generated, I think we generated over 40 questions, so that the audience was very interested in the results of this study. And thank you, Pelle, for answering the questions live as we were going along, and then also afterwards for sticking around a little bit past the time here. But we appreciate everyone joining, and thank you very much. And don't forget about our upcoming seminars on the state of the industry reports coming up in later in April. Thanks, everybody. Have a good one.
Thank you.
Thank you.